I'm Adam Walker, a biometrics consultant, and this is the Pharma Prescribed podcast, where leaders, innovators, and hidden voices in healthcare open up. No sound bites, no spin, just raw insight, one prescription at a time. In an industry driven by data, protocols, and pressure, we rarely pause to ask the human questions. What drives us? What breaks us? And what truths live behind the titles we wear? Today's guest is Andy York, one of the most respected voices in global statistical programming and clinical data science. Andy brings more than 30 years of experience shaping how the industry designs, validates, and delivers statistical outputs for regulatory submission. His career began at Roche and has since spanned senior leadership roles across major pharmaceutical organizations, most recently serving as Vice President of Clinical Data Science at Novo Nordisk, where he played a pivotal role in modernizing data workflows and advancing best practices in clinical reporting. Andy is now an independent consultant, acting as a strategic advisor at Verisian, contributing to their mission of accelerating clinical trial evaluation through AI, graph analytics, and next-generation traceability frameworks. Andy brings deep historical perspective, technical authority, and a forward-looking vision. I have had the pleasure of working with Andy twice across our careers, and I'm delighted to welcome him to Pharma Prescribed today. Andy, for those of our audience who are not familiar with you, who are you and what is the mission you're on?
I'm a statistician by training. I actually did my master's whilst working at Roche, so I did it through part-time. Prior to that, I had a degree in mathematics, stats and computing and OR. Yeah, maths of business, I think you'd probably describe it. But that's where I built my interest in programming, where I learned languages like Fortran, which nobody's probably ever heard of these days, but that's the way we used to do it in the old days. And part of that degree was a six-sandwich course, and I had to spend a year in industry. And I actually spent a year working for a pharma company and learning stats, and got quite good at it within a year, and had a bit of an aptitude for it. So although I'm a trained statistician, my preference is towards programming. Quite a few other people, I think, in the industry as well. But I've got that statistical background and knowledge I kind of draw on. So why the industry? I've always had a life science interest, and it fell into place that working on medicines for people is a really noble cause. You think about improving the life of humans around the planet, and giving them a better quality of life, helping cure diseases or at least alleviate the symptoms of diseases, helping people to live the healthiest lives that they possibly can, given the human condition, if you like, and the things that do go wrong. And that's always been my mantra. And throughout all the companies that I work for, I really look back and feel quite proud on the number of different medicines, for example, that I've worked on over the years, and the advancements that we have brought and are bringing to the world. I can't mention names of drugs really for confidentiality reasons, but I've worked on some of the biggest blockbusters in the world, and you're talking hundreds of millions of people that have taken those drugs, which is a fantastic number, and hopefully improves their lives as a result. So that's pretty much what drives me. So that's who I am, quite an average kind of person, really, to be perfectly honest. Really privileged to be working with this industry and so many great people. I'm still driven by trying to advance medicine and trying to advance the way we do medicine and how we actually submit the data that we analyze, how we actually make the case for the medicines that we've developed and try to get approved with the authorities. To me, that's the ultimate end goal, is increasing the options for patients.
Thank you for summarizing that, Andy. I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with that mission statement. And similar to you, it's the thing that drives me as well, making a difference for people, for patients, for family. And as we get older, dare I say it, for ourselves as well. Over the years, you've seen an awful lot of changes. And from a 30,000 foot view, you've seen so many things and experienced them firsthand in the trenches, in the doing and the advancement of thinking about technology, data collection, all the way through to the reporting process. What are the things that you take away from those learnings that you can pass on to perhaps the next generation of life scientists behind us? Because we have an awful lot of young people listening to this who are keen to get into the industry, but what they're seeing is just the now. How did we get here?
Yeah, several things there in terms of how we get there. But my key message to anybody looking to join the industry is don't put yourself in a box. Don't say, I'm going to be X, and that's all I'm ever going to be in the industry. make sure that you have or take advantage of the opportunities that come along to reinvent yourself as you go along, learn new skills, and adapt to the changes that the world brings. We're all seeing the kind of the AI revolution at the moment, so it makes sense if you join the industry to be ready for that and what that may mean for you in the future, depending on the role that you have. But in terms of what we've seen, obviously, when I started, we had paper CRFs, a 3-part NCR, where the doctors wrote on the top page, the nurses were after the doctors, and there was like carbon copies made of that information, one of which came back to the pharma company or the CRO, who then entered the information. And you spent an awful lot of time checking and cleaning and validating with investigator visits to confirm, did you really mean that? It's a lot of manual effort to try and clean up the data as you went along. And I think if you look at innovation, I think there's some significant steps in how we collect that data and how we treat that data. And that kind of started, funny enough, at Covance with scanning that they introduced within that organization, so that the CRF pages were scanned and sent into the company for data entry. And then you start to get on to kind of like EDC, so that actually you're capturing the information electronically, and that then gets transmitted back to the organization and stored in our data warehouses there. And at the same time, we've got, from the programming perspective, we've got a lot of layering of standards and new different ways of working to support standardization in the industry and working with regulators. When I started, we didn't have things like double programming, for example, where you had an original programmer followed by a validation programmer. And that quickly evolved into double programming because it was seen as an effective way of producing quality control of what you did, particularly within the CRO industry. And then you start to evolve things like standards, things like CDISC standards, SDTM, ADAM, and even beyond that. Of course, all of that was done in SAS, and then we're evolving away from SAS, which is now a 40-year-old language, into using languages like R, which is like a 20, 30-year-old language. So we're moving forward slowly in terms of that, and I think it'll move on even further into future languages. Julia might be an example of something that we use even further in the future. So it does evolve. It does evolve slowly, though, and I think even where AI gets involved, I think we're really only just at the beginning of that journey, and there's a lot of challenges around that. But I don't know how you see that yourself.
Yeah, you make some amazing points there. And I think broadly, those experiences sit alongside my own as well, because we worked at Covance all those years ago when we were both young men. And I do remember the scanning technology coming in. And just by very nature, as I've mentioned many times in this podcast, we work in a very conservative industry where things do happen very slowly. And I think around that point that you make with regards to the future and the future adoption, things are moving so quickly now, aren't they? They appear to be moving quickly on the outside of our industry, on the outside of pharma. But I wonder how quickly those new technologies will really be brought into organizations, and the structure around which those are controlled and managed through the processing out to reporting.
Yeah, I think that is the key question that I see at the moment. I think certainly in companies been recently with the AI focus is that they would like to do it as quickly as they can. And it just doesn't work that way within the pharma industry because of the complexity of what we do. It's not like the banking industry, perhaps, where you're pretty much collecting the same information over time throughout the last 20, 30 years. So you can very readily apply AI methodology to the finance industry or banking or whatever. But in pharma, we deal with some quite diverse data, small amounts of data compared to, say, banking data when you compare the two. It might seem a lot to us, but it's not. And it just gets really hard to set something up that's reliable. I heard the other day something like we can achieve 80% of what we need to do using AI today. That's actually 20% failure to me. And if I look at from a Six Sigma perspective, if you had 20% of the work you do is wrong, that's actually a process that's out of control. And why would you ever adopt that process? So until AI reaches confidence level in the high 90s, at least 95% accuracy, I just don't think we can really honestly say that we're anywhere close. And that's, again, part of the reason I joined a company like Verisian, because they're striving for that. And you do see somewhat ridiculous things as well with the AI, such as descriptions of how to generate an output. And somebody will type out an English language paragraph to say, please generate this table showing adverse events with these conditions or whatever. And by the time they've typed it out, a skilled programmer would actually probably programmed it. So it's not really bringing a lot in that sense. So I think we need to really decide where we're going to use AI as we go forward.
I think that's a really rich perspective you give there around the confidence levels around 95% accuracy. You say that, I know that you've got a statistics head on your shoulders, and that is such a pivotal point that you make there. 80% is not good enough. And in our industry, where patients are absolutely at the center and patient safety is central to everything that we do, you're absolutely nailed on there. So how do we get from 80% to 95 and beyond? And how quickly can we get there? Because you mentioned around your work in advising a company like Verisian. How is that going to develop, and how will that become a reality in a short space of time?
I think the trick is putting guardrails around the AI. So if you just put nothing around it, it's going to give you a lot of hallucinations or garbage and be fairly unconstrained. And you can see that already. If you go online and ask an AI agent to give you an answer to something, you can't be 100% sure it's going to give you the right answer. And there's various stories about inaccuracies that kind of come out of that. And of course, it's improving all the time. It will continue to improve. But if you put guardrails, and those guardrails might be your company's standards for output generation, your company's standards for ADAMs and SCTMs, you can actually start to achieve a much higher rate of success and accuracy with what the AI is trying to do. And I think that's part of what I see and like within the Verisian software, is that they're putting those guardrails into it. So they're quite open about it. It's not perfect. It's not going to do 100% validation correctly. It may get to a very high percentage of that ilk of 25% or more, but they do that because they're doing it smartly, or smarter than other people are perhaps doing it at the moment.
So following on from that, the human in the loop, as far as I understand it, checks and identifies any errors in the AI programming around specific standardization. There is clearly a distinct change between that double programming that used to happen, that we really did have enormous confidence in, to where we're heading towards. What happens in the interim?
In the interim, and I think you're always going to leave that human in the loop, and I think there's nothing to stop you continuing to do double programming and checking the quality and reiterating around the learning that you get within your large language models that you're creating to get them as good as they can be. And those first generation models probably aren't going to be all that great in terms of they're going to hit that 80% perhaps, and that's about it. So you have to iterate, and until you get there, you've got to rely on the human in the loop to make sure that they're checking everything. And I know, for example, the FDA requires that you say whether anything's AI generated these days when you submit. It's how far do you want to push the boundaries there, and what do you want to risk? Because historically, we've all seen the bad days when drugs like thalidomide and so on, and the issues that we saw back then. We certainly don't want to have another one of those occurrences in the industry. So there's no room to get it wrong for our patients in terms of humankind and getting things as good as they can be. So it's going to take time, but the FDA are embracing AI. I mean, they're starting to use AI methods to read submissions. We may find ourselves actually, the traditional kind of shape of the submission that we give may change in order to become easier for their AI to actually read over time, for example, so it becomes more accurate. We're also starting to move away from huge piles of paper. And I remember that, like, 40 boxes of paper going into a submission or being sent off to the FDA or whoever. And these days we have apps. I think while we're working towards having a submission app that actually packages everything up for the FDA, and they can go in there, explore the data, rather than look at 500 pages of lab listings or something like that. So, but it's small steps, and I think it takes people to innovate around that and actually show that they can do that and take some chances around that. But until we get there, we're still stuck with the manual ways of checking everything and making sure that it's right, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts on that as well. As you were describing that, I was thinking about having parallel streams. So parallel streams around the standard way, and then running something concurrently where you're doing a compare and contrast and validating new practice against old practice. Now, that's obviously going to be a fairly heavy lift. So in the short term, to prove that AI and large language models are working, there's going to be more effort and more requirement for involvement of highly qualified people who understand this data and what you're trying to produce. Is that fair? Is that accurate?
I think that's very fair. I think what we have to do initially is create space for ourselves. So at the moment, if you look at your typical stat programming team, they're so overwhelmed with the amount of work that they have to do and the timelines that they have to achieve it in, that actually they can't really stop and think about, can we do this better? How do we improve the process? How do we utilize AI? And I think by utilizing tools like the Verisian tool, and if you can eliminate things like the need for double programming through that tool, you think about the amount of resource that suddenly frees up overnight. You go from 2 FTEs to one to program and one to validate to having maybe 1.2 FTEs to do the same work. And that 0.8 of an FTE can be used so much better to help you think about, actually, now we have all that free time across our teams. How do we move things forward? The other point about that, and is people perhaps miss this if they're outside drug development, is that the opportunities for pharma companies are often restricted by the amount of resources that we have. In one of the companies that I work for, we just had a drug approved, and we were looking at the opportunity space around other indications for that drug. And there were something like 30 plus different areas that they could actually run clinical trials on using that medicine. But the company reduced to like 4 or 5 because the company said, we've only really got resources enough to do 4 or 5. And if you think, you go back to what I said at the start about helping humanity with medicines, if you can look at 10 instead of 5, that's a massive increase in opportunity for patients and for the pharma companies to drive revenue. And you can do that in a much more efficient way, obviously, and actually achieve that with the same amount of resources that you have today just by being smarter with AI. And that, I think, is a huge point to make when looking at the rationale for this. So there's a lot of work to be done now, and I think it's going to take years, knowing our industry. You're probably looking at 10 years, I think.
Thank you for elaborating on that particular point. Again, I was thinking around the role of the regulator alongside transparency with pharma companies and contract research organizations and the supported technology services. Clearly, there are lots of tech companies that want to get into life sciences, drug development, and see pharma as an opportunity to really get the churn going into their models and into their technologies. When you've been at conferences over the last year or two, are there some patterns that you're seeing? Are there conversations that are happening around that? Because I've certainly heard and seen various things. I'd love to hear that from your particular point of view as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, most of the conferences I've been to have been focused on moving away from SAS to R or even Python as a programming language. And there's been an awful lot of focus on that in statistical programming. There is almost a little bit of a cult-like feeling around the use of R and some of the things that people are doing with things like Pharmaverse and so on. And it is great. Joining Novo when they did their R submissions was absolutely fantastic to see them pushing the boundaries and seeing a company where they allowed them to push the boundaries into things like that. And I think it's good also to challenge the establishment. So hopefully it will make SAS innovate more themselves because they're now having to compete in an environment that actually is becoming multilingual rather than just largely based on a single language. And of course, when I started, SAS killed off a number of programming languages that we use, or statistical languages, if you like, that we used in the industry, like BMDP or GLIM and stuff like that, which people haven't even heard of these days. But they were tools that we were using when I started. And it's almost like full circle. There's now something that's pushing SAS a little bit, but they're big enough to innovate, and I think they'll move on. For tech companies trying to break into the industry, I think it's really important to talk to the regulators. And I know that's something that Verisian have been doing, and they have some open invites to go back to the FDA and present on some of their tools. I know that other companies who are successful have done that as well. So I think there's a piece around selling your tool into the industry, but actually there's a piece around getting the regulators to understand what you're trying to achieve as well. I think one of the keys to success as you go forward. But yeah, there's just so many different dimensions at the moment. It's gone from a very easily defined kind of pathway for what we're trying to do, move into standards and then go on from there to drive automation and things like that. that it now seems to have gone off in a much wider direction than it was previously. It's really exciting. Hopefully you see that,
I definitely do. And I wanted to just dig into that point around programming languages, because I think your perspective is rich on this, in the fact that certainly when I joined the industry, it was always SaaS, and I had installed and validated several SaaS systems into companies. They had, and probably still do have, fairly strong handle around the industry. But with respect to many of the young graduates that are coming out of universities now, they are able to program in R and Python. And many of these young people have a very active interest in future-facing programming languages. What are some of the key differences from what you learned and are able to program in SaaS compared to R and Python? Because if I'm understanding correctly, R, Python, Shiny, many of these are open source models. And that I remember being particularly uncomfortable for people to accept, that we were using open source programming tools that were not necessarily fully system held and system validated and were openly accessible to others.
Yeah, it's a very different way of actually working from the point of view that SaaS was always trusted by the regulators in terms of what it did. So if you use SaaS, you were in a very safe place in terms of your statistical analyses and results that you drive. Whereas with R, because it is community driven, anybody can write packages of their own essentially within the system. You have to have a great deal of trust, or certainly you would need to validate the packages that get generated. And that's where things like the Pharmaverse is so critical, or our consortium even, to driving confidence around some of the packages that get produced within those places. I'd encourage people to go and check out the work of Pharmaverse, for example, just to see what exactly exists there. But it's this whole notion of validation by community means that the more a package gets used, the more you can rely upon the results that it's generating. So it's like crowdfunding for packages, really. And the less packages used, the more you have to validate it yourselves to make sure that you're comfortable with what it produces. And I think there's a group in Fuse, maybe in PIS, I can't remember, that kind of validates between the different analyses, even that you get between SAS and R. And a lot of where they see differences can all be explained by different options within the statistical analysis, that the parameters that get specified to do the stats analysis. And you can actually reproduce all of the SAS analyses using R, at least that's my understanding to date, just by applying the right options within R. So everything gets transferable and reproducible. So there's no real concerns there. I think regulators are now more accepting of these open source languages, that they are actually okay to use. And what they don't want to see is custom packages that you built in-house. They'd much rather see you using the open source versions that are available to everybody because of that reliability, which is quite an interesting take on it.
That's a very different approach to what happened in the past, isn't it? Because that's effectively, as you're describing, validation through pure volume, through volume of use and volume of users. And that's a very different mindset, particularly from a regulator's point of view, isn't it? That's something that I would say is significantly different over the course of, let's say, 20 plus years. That if you put yourself into 20 years ago, could you have imagined that happening any more than today, and what that next era looks like?
Yeah, and 20 years ago, nobody would have taken the chance. And I think it's only through a few companies pushing the boundaries and just trying it to see what the outcome would be that we've reached the place where we are now, where actually we're starting to get a rich diversification of languages. In my view, in terms of where we'll end up, is I think we'll still be in a multi-language environment, but it'll be the right language for the right job, for the right task, if you like. SAS has some great tools and abilities within it, particularly around data manipulation. R is great for analytics and graphical output. Python, I suspect, can do it all, and that may be the one that eventually takes over. But it's, again, I don't think we've seen any Python-based submissions, although Novo was dabbling with some regulatory work using Python around the time I left, but in a very small way. So in future, it may well crystallize and harmonize back onto a single language. But I think what we are more likely to see is that the AI actually starts to do the majority of the programming for us in the future, and the humans actually move from code developers to validators to make sure that the AI is generating the output correctly, and that they're using their skill sets there to understand the data far better than perhaps they do at the moment. Because of the pressures that we have today, I think a lot of programmers just follow the specifications without looking at the results. And I think actually it's pretty key that programmers understand the results of what they're producing, because so many errors can be caught that way, rather than taking the approach of the standard says, the specification says something, I've done it to that, so it must be right. I don't know how you say it, but yeah.
Yeah, it definitely requires an elevation of the role of understanding around this. And one thing that I always admired, particularly in statisticians and statistical programmers, when I worked alongside them, was just the eye for detail and the way that you have the ability to tweak a program that just makes the outcomes and the outputs a lot clearer and a lot more understandable.
Yeah.
But you and colleagues like you have a different perspective, mindset, and capability to program those outcomes. Now, what I'm wondering is whether or not those skills are being passed down through generations to the next generations behind you and I, because that was the thing that gave me confidence that the people that were sat alongside me understood what they were doing and why they were doing it. And like you just said there, I would be really uncomfortable with the fact that those skills and that eye for detail was not being brought forward in the work that we're doing in the future.
Yeah, I think there's a real risk, and I think you're absolutely right. I know some time ago they did a poll on the average age of a statistical programmer, and this is perhaps 10 years ago or so. And even then it was in the 30s, late 30s. So it's a demographic that was getting older and older. And it's not the easiest industry for people to join. If you compare earning money working for Google to earning money working for the Pharma, you can earn a lot more at Google. It's attracting people in has always been an issue. I think the onus is on us to make sure that we're training people the right way for the future. And it may be that the statistician role comes back in with the programmer role, because statistician's always been about detail and what the data is showing. And the programmer has been about making sure that we present that information correctly. And so it's almost, there's this more hybrid, I think, as you go forward, where even the stats analyses may in the future be done by AI anyway. So it's entirely possible that you combine these two roles into what we at Novo call a data scientist, as opposed to a stat programmer.
Following on from that point, I'm just wondering how you see that next generation and the skills that they're going to have, because I'm going to make a very broad statement here, but people of my kids' generation in their early 20s, not my kids particularly, they're not gamers, but gamers, people who are spending a lot of time online and looking at strategy, are the kind of people that I think today will make for very good programmers, will they not?
Absolutely. I mean, I have to confess, I play computer games. I've been playing them since I was 18. And I was playing computer games since before there was an internet. And I was playing games online before there was an internet. So, so I go back a long way. And there's a kind of strategic mindset that comes about when you're playing computer games that you would apply to programming to get to the end result. I think they will, and I think they're going to be more comfortable with the technology as well, because they're already working with AI today, as long as they're not cheating on their exams by getting the AI to write the answers for them and stuff like that. But you still need that original thought to go into what they're doing, of course.
Effectively, within the next 10 years, we're looking at kids that will be AI native. Not only have they grown up with a phone and tech in their hand, but AI will be the thing that they go to before they probably speak to their parents, their brothers, their sisters, their peers.
Yeah, it's going to be a very different world, I think, in that respect. And I do read a lot of science fiction and stuff like that, and you can see the older science fiction starting to come into reality now when you look at robots and stuff like that. And there's a lot of AI in science fiction that's coming through into what we do. It's quite fascinating, really. But I think there's also some challenges there. And I think schools are already seeing some challenges of, say, kids coming in who don't know how to interact with humans properly when they come into nursery and can't read or write or stuff like that. So I think as guardians of that generation, I think we need to be really thinking about those kind of things and making sure that we equip them with life skills, not just being good at using the technology that's out there.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful perspective you share there. And just taking one step back, I do remember from a strategy point of view, you were always a brilliant snooker player, right? I've remembered that correctly. You were brilliant then. I bet you still play really well now. And I thought I was pretty good, but you were really good on a full-size table. But also darts. Do I remember you playing darts really well as well?
Yeah, all the vices, snooker, darts, and pool.
Yeah.
I played for a pub pool team at the age of 14. So yeah, very much a misspent childhood in that respect.
Yeah, so that strategy has always been there with you. And that was what I experienced, particularly in those nights out and team building days and afternoons and evenings. But it just came to me while we were talking about that. I just had to share that point. You make some wonderful points around science fiction being science fact these days. And as I say, I think from the perspective of what you've seen and what in the future, can we just bring that centrally back to some of the tools that you're developing now with Verisian? Are you at liberty to share any of those kind of future-facing things and what we can expect coming down the line?
I think the one thing, and I've been working for them for 5 weeks now, and I think the amount of energy that I see in what they're doing is huge. And I think they are looking at where they can go all the time. So at the moment, they started off with something that did straightforward traceability. You read in your SAS code, it created this big map or graph of all the connections with your code and the data. And they built a lot of interfaces around that to make sure that understanding that traceability and working with it is fully understandable and usable by skilled programmers. They're actually building, or they're working in partnership with CDISC at the moment to build about the core functionality within their tools. So they're doing that on an open source basis. It's again a tool that they're going to be providing. They'll probably be talking about that later this year once it's finished. It's still a work in progress. And I was talking to them today about some extensions of things that I feel are possible within their software. Things like doing patient profiles, patient narratives at the push of a button, because they have all the information in there. They can generate things like define.xmls, viewers guides at the push of a button from their traceability that they have at the moment. But there's so many extensions to what they're doing, probably more than they can actually do with the resources they have at the moment. They're on the cusp of something really quite significant. If they invest, hire more people, which they're doing, that they could then add on a lot of things to their environment. And it's brilliant to see, because the aim is to disrupt the industry in terms of what we do, and they are doing it in a way that nobody else is doing, from what I can see. So very exciting times, and look forward to where they're going to end up as a company.
I mean, in identifying you as an advisor, they've obviously done their homework. They don't need to listen to too many podcasts, but anyone who's involved in this industry and has had the experience that you've had comes with enormous capabilities and the breadth of understanding of how that translates into the future-facing point. And I think you've really elaborated and spoken very honestly and openly around that. And that future piece sounds like it's going open source and continuing on a similar sort of vein into the future. So thank you for elaborating on that. And really, thanks so much for sharing your perspective on that, Andy. Are there any particular points that we haven't touched on today that I should have asked you?
Oh, wow. I think we covered a lot of the things I can think of. My advice to people who are currently programmers in the industry, perhaps if you're in your 30s, don't sit on your laurels there thinking that you'll be doing the same thing in 10 years' time. And really start thinking now about how you can diversify some of your skill sets to make use of different languages, perhaps be more engaged with understanding data and upping your kind of involvement across the clinical development cycle. If you're new in the industry or want to break into the industry, think about the directions that we're going in, and be, again, as diverse as you can in terms of your skills, not just your technical programming skills, but how you present yourself and how you would sell yourself to a prospective employer as you go forward. Because I think it's going to be harder for a while, and then I think it'll probably settle down in that 5-10 year span. But I think the signs are that there may be some job cuts and things like that in our area. It's unavoidable, I think. But the ones who succeed are the ones that are able to diversify and think outside the box.
I think it's a wonderful point that you've made there. And just to follow on from that, the other thing I would also echo is the skills of communication. That's where this podcast came from. It was about connecting with people in a new world setting, but also putting information out there for anyone and everyone to learn, to acquire knowledge, and to really understand what happens underneath the hood. Because it isn't a closed industry. It doesn't need to be that way. The goal that I've always had with this particular podcast has been around opening up those conversations, making these things accessible to everyone, not just the people that are in our industry, but those that want to come into it. And there are many. And I would just echo those same points to you, which is diversity of capabilities, broad understanding. It's a bit like learning sport. Do as many different sports as you can. Have multiple capabilities like you, snooker, darts, pool.
That's a pool, yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant. At this point in the conversation, Andy, I always like to conclude with a quick fire round. So
Sure.
if you would be so kind, what is the one piece of advice you would give to your younger self?
My younger self, continue to take risks. I've always taken risks in my jobs and the companies I work for, and it's a lot of fun doing it. What's the worst that can happen? So yeah, take a risk.
I absolutely wholeheartedly echo that point as well. And as I've got older, I've got better at doing that, by the way, as I'm sure you have. What are the top 3 qualities you value most when building a team?
I think ability to listen, ability to present, and ability to learn.
Nice.
So it's the communication. Yeah.
And we've touched on a few things that you enjoy outside of work, but what is the favorite thing you enjoy outside of work?
These days, yeah, I'm not playing too much pool or snooker at the moment, but we go out looking at old houses and stuff like that, and seeing how things were done back in the early years, like Victorian or even Edwardian kind of eras. So we do a fair bit of going around looking at different houses, stately homes and stuff like that. My wife's into gardening, and she's just brilliant at it. She's very chess qualified, so we end up going to a lot of gardens and stuff like that. And yeah, I still play computer games, as I said.
What's your favorite game at the moment?
Dune Awakening I'm playing at the moment.
And finally, what is your number one golden rule in life and in business, Andy?
I think don't fret too much. I think everything sorts itself out. Everything is a lesson.
Absolutely agree with that. We've talked so broadly around your experiences over the last 30 years, and I think you've really given a very clear perspective on what the future might well look like for people coming into our industry. And I cannot thank you enough for being so open and honest around that, Andy. If anyone wants to make contact with you, what is the best way of contacting you?
Probably through LinkedIn initially. I do on my LinkedIn, I publish my Verisian email. So if you want to contact me in relation to Verisian, you can contact me through that. But yeah, LinkedIn is the first point of call, I think.
Thank you ever so much for taking the time today to be on Pharma Prescribed. It's been a pleasure to reconnect with you, Andy, and let's hope we can work together again in the future.
Yeah, always. Really enjoy working with you, and yeah, really enjoyed the podcast today. So thank you.
Thank you, Andy.